One of the rights shareholders have is the right to control, the right to vote. This leads to the question to what extent shareholders actually make use of this right to control, this right to vote. In the literature, this is referred to as shareholder engagement, or sometimes also to shareholder activism. With their right to control, shareholders can try to make decisions differ and have an influence on decisions so that their interests are being covered. This is an important aspect of the rights of shareholders and how shareholders can influence company decisions and outcomes. There are all kinds of ways shareholders can show engagement or activism. And here's a list of all kinds of examples of this engagement. So, for example, shareholders will or can follow the company. They have invested in the company, so they will be interested in how the company does. They can read publications, they can read newspapers about the company, and of course, they can also read the annual reports the company is producing. Shareholders can also vote during annual meetings of shareholders. They can also ask questions during these meetings, questions about how the firm is performing, what kind of decisions the firm had made in the past, and what kind of decisions the company is going to make in the future. Shareholders can also submit so-called resolutions. These are demands or questions that are put on the agenda based on which shareholders can vote. So, for example, they can put on the agenda changes in the rules and the regulations of the company. And based upon these resolutions, votes will be taken. They can also nominate board members. So if a company needs a new board member, shareholders could put forward a person or maybe persons they would like to see as members of the board. They can also rally together with other shareholders against decisions proposed by the board. In this case, shareholders group together because they jointly are not in favor or are against actually some of the decisions proposed by the company. One step further would mean that they actually, outside the meetings of shareholders, have discussions with board members about the decisions these board members are planning to make. And during these informal meetings, shareholders can show and can discuss what they think are important decisions to make. They can ultimately go to court. If they are not in favor of decisions made by the board, they can actually sue the company and try to make changes to decisions made by the company. As you can see, this list of activities, this list of engagement shareholders may show is escalating. So whereas the first is very, very informal and very low in terms of activity, reading does not cost a lot, whereas going to court will cost a lot more, there is an escalation in terms of what shareholders can do in showing engagement. What they can finally do is to sell their shares. So if they're not in agreement with the decisions made by the company, then they can simply decide to step out and sell the shares at the stock exchange. So shareholder engagement may be important because it might actually lead to changes in decisions made by boards. The problem, however, is that depending on how active shareholders will be, these activities are costly. So, whereas on the one hand, successful activities may lead to changes, which may lead to improvements in terms of the returns of shareholders, the shareholders who are active make all the costs of their activity, whereas they have to share the results of their activity with all other shareholders. Because ultimately, if they are successful, the prices of the stocks, the shares they hold, will increase, and that is not only in their own interest, but also in the interest of all other shareholders. This situation may lead to a behavior of individual shareholders where they wait for others to take action. So this actually may lead to free rider problems, a wait and see policy. And that means that ultimately maybe no shareholder will take decisions to be active and instead choose exit over voice. Exit meaning selling over the decision to be active. We call this a shareholder collective action problem. And to overcome this, what is needed is that shareholders try to bundle their activities, they're coordinating their activities. And there are two ways to do this. One is to have informal coordination, and in most cases this means that there is one leading shareholder who takes up the challenge to start being active against the company's management. One example is AkzoNobel, a Dutch company, where a number of activist shareholders like Elliott, Causeway Capital, and some others in 2017 were clearly not in agreement with what the management of AkzoNobel was trying to decide upon for the future. And so they were the ones who started the discussion with the board of AkzoNobel to try to change the decisions made by the board. Another way of trying to change the decisions made by boards can be to organize formal coordination. This means that a separate entity is lobbying, is taking decisions in the name of shareholders. So a separate entity acts as a representative of shareholders. And recently we have actually seen in several countries the existence, the development of these separate entities. So countries like the US, the UK, Canada, the Netherlands, and Italy have this type of separate entities. And here you see a number of examples of such entities. So in the Netherlands, for instance, we have Eumedion, which is a representative of shareholders, institutional shareholders, who invest in Dutch listed companies. And the same holds for the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance. Also, this is a separate entity that represents institutional investors in Canadian listed companies. The Investor Forum is a UK-based organization, and Assogestioni is the organization that is active in Italy. Shareholder engagement, the extent to which shareholders become active and make active use of their right to vote, leads to a number of interesting questions. What channels of shareholder engagement do shareholders use, and does the choice of channels depend on the type of owners? What is investor stewardship, and how does this relate to company decision-making and outcomes? Does shareholder engagement lead to improved company financial performance? What are the most important conditions that determine whether or not shareholder engagement affects company outcomes? And what type of performance is particularly affected by shareholder engagement? Questions related to shareholder collective action could be: what are the determinants of shareholder collective action? And does shareholder collective action influence decisions and outcomes of companies? So, activism, shareholders making use of their voting rights, is a very important topic to discuss when it comes to the role of ownership in corporate governance. So this gives a number of opportunities to do research in your assignment paper.